Right now, you're reading these words. But where is the you that's doing the reading? Is it your brain? Your neurons firing in patterns? Or is there something else, something beyond the physical that makes you conscious? You can't point to your thoughts on an X-ray. You can't weigh your feelings on a scale. So what are they? And if they're not physical, how do they control your physical body? This is the mind-body problem, and for thousands of years, the smartest minds in philosophy have tried to solve it. None have succeeded. But the attempt to answer this question has revealed something far more unsettling. We might not even know what consciousness is. Welcome to Logic Over Spirit. This is your introduction to the philosophy of mind, one of the most fascinating and frustrating branches of philosophy. Over the next hour, we're going to explore the deepest questions about consciousness, thought, and what it means to have a mind. We'll start with the fundamental problem. How does something physical like your brain create something non-physical like your thoughts? We'll examine the major theories philosophers have proposed, from dualism to materialism to functionalism. We'll look at what happens when we try to reduce consciousness to brain activity and why that project might be impossible. We'll confront the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why we have subjective experiences at all. We'll explore whether artificial intelligence could ever be truly conscious. We'll examine free will and whether your choices are really yours. And we'll grapple with the mystery of other minds, the fact that you can never truly know if anyone else is conscious the way you are. This isn't going to give you easy answers. Philosophy of mind is a field where every solution creates new problems, where every theory has devastating objections, where the more you learn, the less certain you become. But if you want to understand what you are, if you want to think clearly about consciousness, identity, and the nature of thought itself, then you're in the right place. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand why the mind-body problem has haunted philosophy since ancient times. You'll see why modern neuroscience hasn't solved it. And you'll have the tools to think about your own consciousness in ways you never have before. So let's begin with the problem that started it all. Chapter 1. The mind-body problem. The mind-body problem is simple to state but impossible to solve. Your mind seems to be fundamentally different from your body. Your thoughts, feelings, sensations, and experiences seem to be private, subjective, and immaterial. Your body is public, objective, and material. Yet somehow, these two completely different things interact. Your mental decision to raise your arm causes your physical arm to move. Physical damage to your brain changes your mental experiences. How is this possible? How can something immaterial affect something material? How can neurons and chemicals produce the felt experience of tasting chocolate or seeing red or feeling love? This isn't just an abstract puzzle. It's deeply personal. Right now, you're having subjective experiences. You're seeing these words, understanding their meaning, perhaps feeling curious or skeptical or bored. But where are these experiences? They're not in your skull the way your brain is in your skull. You can open up a brain and see neurons, but you'll never see a thought. You can measure electrical activity, but you can't measure the subjective feeling of what it's like to have that activity. The philosopher Thomas Nagel wrote a famous paper called, "What is it like to be a bat?" His point was that bats experience the world through echolocation, a sense we don't have. We can study bat brains, we can understand the physics of echolocation, but we can never know what it's like to be a bat. We can never experience their subjective experience. And this reveals something crucial. Consciousness has a first-person, subjective quality that can't be captured by third-person, objective science. This is the explanatory gap. There seems to be an unbridgeable gap between physical descriptions of the brain and mental descriptions of experience. You can describe every neuron firing in my brain when I see red, but that description will never capture what red looks like to me. The physical facts seem to leave out the experiential facts. So, how do we solve this? Throughout history, philosophers have proposed three main approaches. Either mind and body are two separate substances, or everything is fundamentally mental, or everything is fundamentally physical. Let's examine each of these positions and see why none of them quite work. Chapter 2. Dualism. Two substances. The most intuitive solution to the mind-body problem is dualism. This is the view that mind and body are two fundamentally different kinds of substances. Your body is physical, extended in space, subject to physical laws. Your mind is non-physical, not located in space, not subject to physical laws. You are essentially two things: a physical body and a non-physical soul or mind. This view was most famously defended by René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes noticed that he could doubt the existence of his body. He could imagine being deceived about having a body, but he couldn't doubt the existence of his mind. After all, to doubt is to think, and thinking proves that a thinking thing exists. This led to his famous conclusion, "I think, therefore I am." From this, Descartes argued that mind and body must be different substances because they have different properties. The body is divisible. You can lose a limb and still exist. The mind is indivisible. You can't lose half your consciousness. The body is public and observable. The mind is private and known only to itself. These differences, Descartes thought, proved that mind and body are fundamentally distinct. Dualism has some appealing features. It matches our intuitive sense that we're not just our bodies. It explains how mental properties like meaning, intentionality, and consciousness could exist because they're not reducible to physical properties. It's compatible with most religious views about the soul. And it seems to preserve human dignity and free will by making us more than just physical machines. But dualism faces devastating objections. The biggest problem is the interaction problem. If mind and body are completely different substances, how do they interact? Your mental decision to raise your arm somehow causes physical neurons to fire and physical muscles to contract. But how? How does something non-physical exert force on something physical? This seems to violate the principle of causal closure, the idea that physical events have physical causes. Descartes himself recognized this problem and proposed that mind and body interact through the pineal gland, a small structure in the brain. But this doesn't solve anything. It just moves the mystery. How does the non-physical mind affect the pineal gland? The interaction problem remains. There's also the problem of mental causation. If the physical world is causally closed, if every physical event has a sufficient physical cause, then mental events become causally irrelevant. Your neurons were going to fire whether you decided to raise your arm or not. Your conscious decision is just an epiphenomenon, a byproduct that doesn't actually do anything. But that contradicts our deepest intuitions about our own agency. Modern neuroscience creates additional problems for dualism. We now know that specific mental functions are localized to specific brain regions. Damage to certain areas causes specific mental deficits. Drugs that affect brain chemistry change mental states. Brain activity precedes conscious awareness of decisions. All of this suggests that mental events are identical to, or at least dependent on, physical brain events, not separate from them. Finally, there's the problem of emergence. If minds are non-physical, when did they emerge in evolutionary history? Do insects have non-physical minds? Do bacteria? Where do you draw the line? And how did natural selection produce something non-physical? Evolution works on physical traits. If minds are non-physical, they're invisible to evolution. Despite these problems, some versions of dualism remain popular, especially in religious contexts. But most philosophers have abandoned it in favor of views that try to explain the mind in physical terms. Let's turn to those views now. Chapter 3. Materialism. Everything is physical. If dualism is wrong, the most obvious alternative is materialism, also called physicalism. This is the view that everything that exists is physical. There is no separate mental substance. Minds are not distinct from bodies. Mental states are identical to or constituted by physical states, specifically brain states. The appeal of materialism is clear. It's parsimonious, it doesn't multiply entities unnecessarily, it's compatible with science, which has been spectacularly successful at explaining phenomena in physical terms. It avoids the interaction problem because there's only one kind of substance. And it fits with evolutionary theory, which explains the origin of minds as products of physical evolution. But what exactly does it mean to say minds are physical? There are several versions of materialism, each with its own problems. The crudest version is the identity theory, which says that mental states are identical to brain states. Pain is just C fibers firing. Seeing red just is a particular pattern of neural activity in the visual cortex. Every mental state is identical to some physical state. But this faces immediate objections. First, there's the multiple realizability problem. Different physical systems can realize the same mental state. Humans, octopuses, and potentially artificial intelligences could all feel pain, but they would have very different physical structures. Pain can't be identical to C fibers firing because creatures without C fibers can feel pain. Mental states seem to be multiply realizable in different physical substrates. Second, there's the problem of qualia, the subjective qualitative aspects of experience, the redness of red, the painfulness of pain, the sweetness of sugar. When I see red, there's something it's like to see red, a subjective character to the experience. But no description of neurons firing captures this subjective quality. You could know everything about the neuroscience of color perception and still not know what red looks like. The philosopher Frank Jackson illustrated this with his famous thought experiment about Mary. Mary is a brilliant scientist who knows everything physical there is to know about color vision. She knows all the facts about wavelengths, retinal cells, neural pathways, everything. But she's lived her entire life in a black and white room and has never actually seen colors. One day, she leaves the room and sees red for the first time. Does she learn something new? It seems obvious that she does. She learns what red looks like. But if materialism is true, if all facts are physical facts, then Mary already knew everything. The fact that she learns something new when she sees red suggests there are non-physical facts, facts about subjective experience that can't be captured by physical descriptions. Materialists have tried to defend against this. Some say Mary doesn't learn a new fact, she just acquires a new ability, the ability to recognize and imagine red. Others say she learns a new way of representing an old fact, not a new fact itself. But these responses seem forced. The intuition that Mary learns something new is very strong. Another problem for materialism is the explanatory gap. Even if mental states are identical to brain states, there's still an explanatory gap between physical and mental descriptions. You can describe all the physical facts about pain, but that won't explain why pain feels the way it does. The physical story seems to leave something out. The philosopher Joseph Levine argues that even if materialism is true, there's an unbridgeable explanatory gap. We can't explain consciousness in physical terms in the way we can explain other phenomena. We can explain water in terms of H2O molecules because we can deduce the properties of water from the properties of H2O, but we can't deduce the subjective feel of pain from facts about C fibers. The connection remains mysterious. Some materialists respond by biting the bullet. They say consciousness is an illusion, or that our intuitions about consciousness are simply wrong. The philosopher Daniel Dennett argues that there are no qualia, no subjective feelings that are distinct from their physical basis. What we call consciousness is just a complex pattern of information processing that creates the illusion of something more. But this seems to deny the one thing we're most certain of, our own conscious experience. Descartes was right about one thing. We can doubt everything except that we're having experiences. To deny consciousness seems to deny the very thing we're trying to explain. Despite these problems, most philosophers working today are materialists of some kind. They think minds must be physical because everything is physical. But they disagree about how to understand the relationship between mental and physical. This brings us to functionalism, currently the most popular view in philosophy of mind. Chapter 4. Functionalism. Minds as software. Functionalism is a clever attempt to be materialist while avoiding the problems of identity theory. The key insight is that mental states should be defined not by what they're made of, but by what they do, by their functional role in the cognitive system. Think of it this way. What makes something a mousetrap? Not what it's made of. You can make mousetraps from wood, plastic, or metal. What matters is its function, what it does. It's designed to catch mice. Similarly, what makes something a pain state isn't the physical substrate, but its functional role. Pain is whatever state is caused by tissue damage, causes withdrawal behavior, and causes the belief that something is wrong. This solves the multiple realizability problem. Humans, octopuses, and robots could all feel pain if they have states that play the same functional role, even if those states are physically very different. Mental states are multiply realizable because what matters is function, not physical composition. Functionalism also seems to capture something important about minds. Minds are information processing systems. They take inputs from the environment, process them according to rules, and produce outputs. This is how computers work, and functionalism suggests minds work the same way. Mental states are computational states. This leads to the computational theory of mind, which says thinking is computation. Your brain is running a program, and your mental states are the states of that program. Just as the same software can run on different hardware, the same mind could run on different physical substrates. This is why artificial intelligence is possible in principle. If minds are just software, we could run that software on computers. But functionalism faces serious objections. The most famous is John Searle's Chinese room argument. Imagine a person who doesn't speak Chinese locked in a room with a rule book. Chinese symbols come in through a slot. The person follows the rule book to manipulate symbols and passes Chinese symbols back out. To outside observers, the room appears to understand Chinese. It receives Chinese questions and gives appropriate Chinese answers. But the person inside doesn't understand Chinese. They're just following syntactic rules, manipulating symbols without understanding their meaning. They don't know what the symbols mean. Searle argues this shows that computation is not sufficient for understanding or consciousness. A system can perform all the right functions without having subjective experiences or genuine understanding. Functionalists have many responses to the Chinese room. Some say the whole system, the person plus the rule book, understands Chinese even if the person alone doesn't. Others say Searle's intuitions are wrong, that a system that behaved exactly like it understood Chinese would understand Chinese. But the debate continues. Another problem is the inverted spectrum. Imagine two people whose color experiences are inverted. When you see red, I see what you would call green, and vice versa. But we've learned the same color words, so we both call grass green and blood red. Our functional states are identical, but our subjective experiences are inverted. Is this possible? If it is, it shows that functional role doesn't determine subjective experience. Two systems could be functionally identical but have different qualities. But functionalism says mental states are identical to functional states. If qualia can vary independently of function, functionalism is false. Functionalists often respond that inverted spectrum is actually impossible. They argue that color experiences are too interconnected with other mental states for such an inversion to be possible. But this response doesn't fully satisfy critics. There's also the problem of consciousness. Functionalism might explain cognitive functions like memory, reasoning, and decision-making. But does it explain subjective experience? Why would information processing feel like anything? Why isn't it all unconscious? A zombie, a being that's functionally identical to you but lacks consciousness, seems conceivable. But if such a thing is possible, then functional organization doesn't guarantee consciousness. Despite these problems, functionalism remains popular because it offers a way to be materialist while respecting the complexity and flexibility of mental states. But it may ultimately face the same problem as other forms of materialism. It can explain cognitive functions but not conscious experience. This brings us to what many consider the deepest problem in philosophy of mind. Chapter 5. The hard problem of consciousness. The philosopher David Chalmers distinguishes between the easy problems and the hard problem of consciousness. The easy problems, despite the name, are the cognitive functions we can explain in principle through neuroscience and cognitive science. How do we discriminate against stimuli? How do we integrate information? How do we report mental states? These are difficult, but we know the kind of explanation we're looking for, functional and mechanistic explanations. The hard problem is different. It's the problem of explaining why there's something it's like to be conscious, why we have subjective experiences at all. Why doesn't all this information processing happen in the dark? Why is it accompanied by inner experience? Consider vision. We can explain how light hits the retina, how signals travel through the optic nerve, how the visual cortex processes different features. We can explain all the cognitive functions of vision, but none of this explains why visual processing is accompanied by the subjective experience of seeing colors, shapes, and depths. There's an explanatory gap between the functional story and the experiential story. Chalmers argues that no amount of information about brain function will close this gap. You could know everything about the functional organization of the brain and still be surprised to discover that it's accompanied by conscious experience. Consciousness seems to be something over and above functional organization. This leads to several possible conclusions, none of them comfortable. First, maybe consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, like mass or charge. Just as physics posits fundamental properties to explain material phenomena, maybe we need to posit consciousness as fundamental to explain mental phenomena. This view is called panpsychism, and it suggests that even simple systems have some form of consciousness, though vastly simpler than human consciousness. Panpsychism sounds crazy, but it has some appeal. It avoids having to explain how consciousness emerges from non-conscious matter, because all matter already has some degree of consciousness. It explains why consciousness is ubiquitous in biological systems, and it fits with some interpretations of quantum mechanics that give consciousness a role in collapsing wave functions. But panpsychism has its own problems. How do micro-experiences of particles combine to form unified human consciousness? This is called the combination problem. If an electron has some primitive form of experience, how do billions of electron experiences combine into your unified experience? Regular physical properties combine straightforwardly, but it's unclear how subjective experiences combine. Second, maybe consciousness is not physical at all. Maybe some form of dualism is correct after all. Property dualism says that while there's only one kind of substance, that substance has two kinds of properties: physical properties and mental properties. Mental properties like consciousness are real and irreducible, but they're properties of physical systems, not separate substances. This avoids the worst problems of substance dualism while still recognizing consciousness as something distinct from physical properties, but it faces its own version of the interaction problem. How do mental properties affect physical properties? If consciousness is non-physical, how does it cause behavior? Third, maybe we need to expand our concept of the physical. Some philosophers argue that physics gives us only a structural or relational description of reality. It tells us how things interact, not what they are intrinsically. Maybe consciousness is what matter is intrinsically, from the inside. This view, called Russellian monism, tries to reconcile materialism with the irreducibility of consciousness. Fourth, maybe consciousness is an illusion. Maybe there is no hard problem because there's nothing to explain. When we think we have subjective experiences that can't be explained functionally, we're confused about our own minds. This is the illusionist position, defended by philosophers like Keith Frankish and Daniel Dennett. But how can consciousness be an illusion? Illusions are conscious experiences that misrepresent reality. To have an illusion of consciousness, you'd need to be conscious. The very act of questioning whether you're conscious presupposes consciousness. This seems to be one thing we can't be wrong about. The hard problem remains unsolved. Most philosophers acknowledge it as a serious challenge. Some think it shows materialism is false. Others think it shows we need to radically revise our understanding of the physical. Still others think it's an illusion created by confused thinking. But nobody has a solution that convinces everyone, and this raises a troubling question. If we can't explain our own consciousness, how can we know whether anything else is conscious? Chapter 6. The Problem of Other Minds. You know you're conscious because you directly experience your own consciousness. But how do you know anyone else is conscious? You can observe their behavior, you can scan their brains, but you can never directly experience their experiences. For all you know, everyone else could be a philosophical zombie, a being that acts exactly like a conscious person but has no inner experience. This is the problem of other minds. It's been recognized since ancient times, but it takes on new urgency in light of modern developments in artificial intelligence and neuroscience. The traditional answer is the argument from analogy. Other people have bodies similar to mine and behave similarly to me. When I'm in certain states, I'm conscious, so probably when they're in similar states, they're conscious too. It's an inference to the best explanation. The best explanation for why other people behave as they do is that they're conscious like me, but this argument is weak. It's an inductive argument based on a single case. My own consciousness. That's not much to generalize from. And the analogy isn't perfect. Other people's brains are physically similar to mine, but we've already established that physical similarity might not be sufficient for consciousness. Some philosophers argue that the problem of other minds is a pseudo-problem. Ludwig Wittgenstein suggested that consciousness is not a private inner state, but a public phenomenon. To be conscious is to behave in certain ways in certain contexts. If something behaves like it's conscious, it is conscious. There's no additional inner fact. But this seems to deny what consciousness is. Consciousness is precisely that private inner experience. A perfect simulation of a conscious being would behave identically to a conscious being, but it might lack actual experience. Behavior doesn't guarantee consciousness. This problem becomes acute when we consider artificial intelligence. Current AI systems can perform impressive tasks. They can beat humans at chess and Go, recognize faces, translate languages, and generate human-like text. But are they conscious? Do they have subjective experiences? Most people's intuition is no. Current AI, no matter how sophisticated, is just manipulating symbols according to rules. It's not experiencing anything. But how do we know? What test could we perform to determine if an AI is conscious? Alan Turing proposed the Turing test. If a machine can converse indistinguishably from a human, it should be considered intelligent. But intelligence isn't consciousness. An AI could pass the Turing test through clever programming without having any inner experience. The Chinese room argument makes this point powerfully. Some philosophers propose more sophisticated tests. Thomas Nagel suggests we should look for signs of subjective perspective, for systems that have a point of view on the world. Daniel Dennett argues we should look for intentionality, the capacity to have thoughts about things. But these criteria are controversial and difficult to apply. The problem deepens when we consider that consciousness might come in degrees or different kinds. Are insects conscious? They behave adaptively, they respond to stimuli, they learn. But is there something it's like to be an ant? Are they just biological robots? Or do they have some primitive form of experience? What about plants? They respond to their environment, communicate through chemical signals, even seem to remember past experiences. But we don't usually think plants are conscious. Why not? Is it because they lack nervous systems? But if consciousness is about information processing, not specific physical substrate, why couldn't plants process information consciously? The problem of other minds also has ethical implications. If we can't be certain what's conscious, how do we know what entities deserve moral consideration? Most people think humans deserve moral consideration because we're conscious, we can suffer. Many extend this to animals. But where do we draw the line? Peter Singer argues we should extend moral consideration to any being capable of suffering. But how do we know what's capable of suffering? Mammals clearly seem to suffer. But fish? Insects? AI systems? If we can't solve the problem of other minds, we can't fully answer these ethical questions. Some philosophers embrace a kind of skepticism about other minds. We can never be certain, so we should be cautious and generous in attributing consciousness. Better to treat something as conscious when it's not, than to treat something as not conscious when it is. Others try to find objective criteria for consciousness. Integrated information theory, proposed by Giulio Tononi, suggests consciousness corresponds to a system's degree of integrated information, measured by a quantity called phi. Systems with high phi are highly conscious. Systems with low phi are minimally or not conscious. This theory is mathematically sophisticated and potentially testable, but it has strange implications. It suggests that certain non-biological systems could be conscious, and that some simple systems might be more conscious than we'd expect. And it's not clear the theory really solves the problem rather than just quantifying something we do not fully understand. The problem of other minds reveals how limited our understanding of consciousness really is. We can't even be certain about consciousness in beings similar to us, let alone radically different systems. And this connects to another deep puzzle about minds. Chapter 7. Personal Identity and the Self. Who are you? What makes you the same person today as you were 10 years ago? Your body has changed. Most of your cells have been replaced. Your beliefs and desires have changed. Your memories have changed. So what makes you, you? This is the problem of personal identity. And it's closely connected to philosophy of mind because it asks what the self is and whether it persists over time. One answer is the body criterion. You are your body. You're the same person over time because you have the same body despite cellular changes. This seems to fit with materialism. If minds are identical to brains, then you are your brain, and you persist as long as your brain persists. But this faces problems. Imagine a brain transplant. Your brain is removed and placed in another body. Where are you? Intuitively, you go with your brain, not your original body. This suggests you are your brain, not your whole body. But even this is problematic. Your brain changes over time. Neurons die and new connections form. Memories are stored and lost. If you are your brain, you're constantly becoming a different person. John Locke proposed an alternative, the psychological criterion. You are not your body, but your mental continuity. You're the same person over time if there's a chain of psychological connections linking your present self to your past self. The most important connection is memory. You're the same person who experienced past events if you remember experiencing them. This has appeal. It explains why we care about personal identity. We care because we care about psychological continuity. It explains intuitions about brain transplants. You go with your psychology, not your body. And it fits with how we think about ourselves. We identify with our memories, beliefs, and character, not with our particular cells. But the psychological criterion faces problems too. First, memory is fallible. You might falsely remember doing things you didn't do. Does that make you the person who did those things? Second, memory is partial. You don't remember most of your life. Are those forgotten times not part of your history? Third, there's the duplication problem. Imagine we could copy your brain state perfectly and create an exact duplicate of you. This duplicate would have all your memories, beliefs, and personality. By the psychological criterion, they would be you. But so would the original you. Can there be two of you? That seems impossible. Personal identity requires numerical identity. There can only be one of you. Derek Parfit explored these puzzles in his book, Reasons and Persons. He argued that personal identity is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity, whether or not that continuity involves identity. If you were to divide like an amoeba, creating two people each with half your brain and your memories, neither might be identical to you, but both would be psychologically continuous with you. And that's what you should care about. Parfit's view is radical. It suggests that you might not exist in the way you think you do. Personal identity might be a useful fiction we tell ourselves, but what really exists is a series of mental states connected by psychological relations. There's no deep fact about whether you're the same person over time, just different ways of describing patterns of psychological continuity. This connects to Buddhist philosophy, which teaches that the self is an illusion. What we call the self is just a bundle of mental states, thoughts, feelings, sensations arising and passing away. There's no permanent self that has these states. The belief in a self is the root of suffering, and liberation comes from recognizing there is no self. Modern neuroscience seems to support this. There's no self-center in the brain. The sense of self arises from the integrated activity of many brain regions. Damage to certain areas can fragment this sense, creating split-brain patients who seem to have two separate streams of consciousness, or patients who lose the sense that their actions are their own. But the no-self view is hard to accept. When I think I am thinking, who is the I? When I remember my childhood, who is remembering? There seems to be a subject of experience, a perspective from which mental states are experienced. Some philosophers distinguish between the narrative self and the minimal self. The narrative self is the story we tell about who we are, our autobiography, our sense of identity over time. This might be constructed and even illusory. But the minimal self, the bare subject of experience in each moment, might be real and unavoidable. Whenever there's conscious experience, there's a perspective, a point of view from which that experience occurs. The problem of personal identity shows how unclear our concept of the self really is. Are we bodies, brains, psychological continuities, narratives, or nothing at all? And this uncertainty extends to another central question about minds. Chapter 8. Free Will and Mental Causation. Do you have free will? When you make a decision, is it really you making it? Or is your brain just following physical laws that determine everything you do? This is one of the most contentious issues in philosophy of mind. It matters because our entire moral and legal system assumes people are responsible for their actions. But responsibility seems to require free will. If your actions are determined by prior physical causes, how can you be responsible for them? The traditional problem of free will concerns determinism, the thesis that every event is causally determined by prior events according to natural laws. If determinism is true, then given the past and the laws of nature, the future is fixed. Your decision to read this was determined by prior brain states, which were determined by earlier states stretching back before you were born. Some philosophers are compatibilists. They argue free will is compatible with determinism. You're free as long as you act according to your own desires and beliefs, even if those desires and beliefs were determined. A person who acts on their own motivations is free, even if those motivations were caused. But others find this unsatisfying. They argue that real freedom requires alternative possibilities. You're only free if you could have done otherwise. And if determinism is true, you couldn't have done otherwise. Given the past and the laws, you had to do exactly what you did. Libertarians, not the political kind, but the free will kind, argue that we have free will and therefore determinism must be false. Our choices are not determined by prior causes, but are genuinely free acts of will. This requires rejecting the causal closure of the physical, the idea that physical events always have sufficient physical causes. But this creates problems. If your choices aren't caused by anything, aren't they just random? How is randomness any more compatible with responsibility than determinism? If your action wasn't caused by your reasons, beliefs, or character, in what sense is it your action? Modern neuroscience has intensified this debate. Benjamin Libet's experiments in the 1980s seem to show that unconscious brain activity precedes conscious decisions. When subjects decided to move their hand, brain activity associated with that movement began several hundred milliseconds before they consciously decided to move. This suggests the brain makes the decision before you consciously experience making it. More recent research has replicated and extended these findings. Brain activity can predict simple decisions several seconds before subjects report making them. This seems to show that consciousness is not in the driver's seat. The brain decides, and consciousness experiences the decision afterward, creating the illusion that you decided. Some philosophers and scientists conclude from this that free will is an illusion. Sam Harris argues that the feeling of being a conscious agent who makes free choices is a persistent illusion. Your thoughts and actions arise from causes you don't control and didn't choose. The sense of free will is just a story your brain tells itself, but others push back against this interpretation. They argue that Libet's experiments only show that conscious awareness of a decision comes after neural preparation for action, not that the decision itself is unconscious. The buildup of neural activity might be part of the decision process, not prior to it. Moreover, these experiments involve arbitrary decisions about when to move. They don't test deliberative decisions based on reasons. When you carefully weigh options and choose based on your values, your conscious reasoning might play a genuine causal role. Alfred Mele argues that free will is compatible with neuroscience. Even if neural activity precedes conscious awareness, that activity might be part of you, part of your agency. As long as your actions flow from your character, values, and reasoning, they're free, even if the neural implementation of those things operates partly unconsciously. The debate over free will connects deeply to the mind-body problem. If minds are identical to brains, and brains are physical systems governed by natural laws, then our actions are determined by physical causes. But if minds are something over and above brains, there might be room for non-physical mental causation, for choices that aren't determined by prior physical states. However, if mental events are non-physical, how do they cause physical events? This is just the interaction problem again. And if mental events don't cause physical events, then consciousness becomes epiphenomenal, irrelevant to action. Your conscious experiences would be like steam from a locomotive, produced by the engine but not affecting its motion. Most philosophers want to avoid epiphenomenalism. We want consciousness to matter, to play a causal role in behavior. But reconciling this with physicalism is difficult. If all physical events have sufficient physical causes, mental events seem causally superfluous. Some philosophers propose emergentism. Mental properties emerge from physical properties but have their own causal powers. Just as liquidity emerges from molecular properties but has its own causal powers, consciousness emerges from neural properties but can cause behavior in ways not reducible to neural descriptions. But critics argue this is either dualism in disguise or doesn't really give mental properties independent causal power. If mental properties supervene on physical properties, meaning they're fully determined by physical properties, then physical properties do all the causal work. Mental properties become mere labels for physical patterns. The free will debate remains unresolved. It's deeply connected to questions about consciousness, causation, and the nature of the self. And it shows how philosophy of mind isn't just abstract theorizing, but has profound implications for how we understand ourselves as agents. Chapter 9. Intentionality and Meaning. One of the most puzzling features of minds is intentionality. This doesn't mean intention in the ordinary sense of planning to do something. In philosophy, intentionality means aboutness. Mental states are about things. Your beliefs are about the world. Your desires are about outcomes. Your thoughts refer to objects, properties, and situations. This might seem trivial until you realize that nothing physical has this property. A rock isn't about anything. A tree isn't about anything. Even brain states, considered purely as physical states, aren't about anything. They're just neurons firing in patterns. Yet somehow mental states have this remarkable property of being directed at things beyond themselves. How is this possible? How can physical brain states represent or refer to things in the world? This is the problem of intentionality, and it's central to understanding what minds are. One attempt to explain intentionality is through causation. Maybe mental states are about things that cause them. Your belief that there's a tree in front of you is about that tree because the tree causes your belief. Your concept of tree refers to trees because trees cause you to take on that concept. But this faces problems. First, misrepresentation. You can believe there's a tree when there isn't one. Your belief is still about a tree even though no tree caused it. Causal theories struggle to explain how we can think about things that do not exist or have false beliefs. Second, the disjunction problem. Your concept of horse might be caused by horses, but also by zebras seen at a distance, or by horse pictures, or by people saying horse. Does your concept refer to horses or zebras or pictures or utterances? Causation is too crude to capture the specificity of mental content. Third, abstract concepts. You can think about numbers, justice, possibilities, impossibilities. These things don't cause anything, yet your thoughts are about them. Causal theories can't explain intentionality about abstract objects. Another approach is through functional roles. Maybe what makes a mental state about something is its functional connections to other mental states, to perceptual inputs, and to behavioral outputs. Your belief that it's raining is about rain because it's connected to rain perceptions, to beliefs about getting wet, to desires to take an umbrella, and to behavior like staying inside. This captures something important. Mental content is holistic, embedded in networks of relations, but it faces its own problems. Different people might have different functional roles for the same concept. Does that mean they're thinking about different things? And how do we individuate functional roles precisely enough to determine specific content? Some philosophers argue that intentionality is irreducible, a fundamental feature of minds that can't be explained in non-intentional terms. This is similar to treating consciousness as fundamental. Just as we might accept that subjective experience is basic and inexplicable, we might accept that aboutness is basic and inexplicable, but this seems like giving up. Science succeeds by reducing complex phenomena to simpler ones. If intentionality is irreducible, that suggests minds are fundamentally different from everything else in nature. The problem of intentionality connects to debates about externalism and internalism. Internalists think mental content is determined entirely by what's in your head, by your internal brain states. Externalists think mental content depends partly on your environment and history. Hilary Putnam's famous twin Earth thought experiment supports externalism. Imagine a planet exactly like Earth, except that the liquid in lakes and rivers is H2O, but a different molecule, XYZ, though it looks and tastes identical. When you think water, you're thinking about H2O. When your twin Earth duplicate thinks water, they're thinking about XYZ. Same brain state, different content. This suggests content isn't entirely in the head, but depends on environmental context. Tyler Burge extended this with social externalism. The content of your thoughts depends partly on your linguistic community. If you mistakenly think arthritis can occur in the thigh, your thought, "I have arthritis in my thigh," still refers to the medical condition arthritis, not to whatever you think arthritis is. The social meaning of arthritis determines your thought content. If externalism is right, it has strange implications. You couldn't know what you're thinking just by introspection. You'd need to know about your environment and history. And artificial brains in vats couldn't have thoughts about water or trees because they wouldn't have the right causal connections to those things. The problem of intentionality shows that minds have properties that are difficult to explain in purely physical terms. Mental states point beyond themselves to objects and properties in the world. They have meaning and content, and it's unclear how neurons and chemistry could generate meaning. This connects to the Chinese room argument. Searle's point wasn't just about consciousness, but about intentionality. The person in the room manipulates symbols without understanding their meaning. They have syntax, but not semantics. Searle argues that purely computational systems, including brains if they're just computational, can't generate genuine meaning or intentionality. But if brains do generate meaning, and brains are physical, then somehow the physical must be able to produce the intentional. This is another aspect of the mind-body problem, perhaps as difficult as explaining consciousness. Chapter 10. Artificial Intelligence and Machine Consciousness. All these questions about consciousness, intentionality, and mental causation come to a head when we consider artificial intelligence. Could we create conscious machines? Could AI systems have genuine thoughts and feelings? Or are they forever limited to being sophisticated but mindless calculators? This isn't science fiction anymore. Modern AI systems can perform tasks that seem to require intelligence. Large language models can engage in human-like conversation, answer complex questions, write essays, even pass professional exams. Image recognition systems can identify objects better than humans. Game-playing AI can master complex strategy games. But are these systems conscious? Do they understand anything? Or are they, as Searle would argue, just manipulating symbols without meaning, performing computations without experience? The functionalist would say that if an AI system performs all the functions of a conscious mind, it is conscious. If it processes information, responds to stimuli, reports mental states, and behaves indistinguishably from a conscious being, then it is conscious. Function is all that matters. But the thought experiments we've discussed cast doubt on this. The Chinese room seems to show that function isn't sufficient for understanding or consciousness. A system could perform all the right functions while lacking genuine mental states, and the zombie argument suggests that behavioral and functional similarity don't guarantee consciousness. Some philosophers distinguish between weak AI and strong AI. Weak AI is the thesis that computers can simulate mental processes. Strong AI is the thesis that appropriately programmed computers don't just simulate minds, but actually are minds. They genuinely think and understand. John Searle argues that strong AI is false. Computers manipulate formal symbols based on syntactic rules, but minds have semantic content, they understand meaning. Syntax alone can never generate semantics. No matter how sophisticated the program, it's still just symbol manipulation. But others argue that brains are also symbol manipulators, just biological ones. If brains can generate consciousness and meaning through their information processing, why couldn't artificial systems do the same? What's special about biological substrates? One answer might be that consciousness requires the right kind of information processing, not just any information processing. Integrated information theory suggests consciousness corresponds to integrated information, and perhaps biological brains integrate information in ways that classical computers don't. Another possibility is that consciousness requires embodiment. Minds evolved to control bodies in environments. Pure disembodied computation might not be sufficient for consciousness. You need sensory-motor interaction with the world. This might explain why evolution produced consciousness while pure mathematical computation might not. The advent of neural networks and deep learning has made AI more brain-like. These systems don't follow explicit programmed rules but learn from data, developing their own internal representations. Does this make them more likely to be conscious? It's unclear. Neural networks are still computational systems, still manipulating numerical values according to mathematical operations. They're inspired by brains, but still fundamentally different. Biological neurons use complex biochemistry, involve intricate temporal dynamics, and are embedded in complex bodily systems. Artificial neurons are simplified mathematical functions. Some researchers are trying to create more brain-like AI, using neuromorphic hardware that more closely mimics biological neural processes. If consciousness depends on specific features of biological computation, perhaps these more brain-like systems could be conscious. But we face an epistemological problem. Even if we create an AI system that seems conscious, how would we know? We can't directly experience its experiences. We're back to the problem of other minds. The AI might pass any behavioral test while lacking genuine consciousness. Some philosophers propose consciousness tests. Does the system have a unified sense of self? Can it reflect on its own mental states? Does it show genuine creativity and flexibility? But these criteria are controversial and might be gameable by sophisticated unconscious systems. There's also the question of moral status. If we create conscious AI, do we have moral obligations toward it? Would it be wrong to delete a conscious AI? To create it for purposes it doesn't consent to? These questions seem abstract now, but they might become pressing as AI advances. The possibility of machine consciousness also raises questions about the substrate independence of mind. If minds can be implemented in silicon as well as carbon, that supports functionalism and suggests consciousness is multiply realizable. But if consciousness requires biological substrate, that might support views that tie consciousness more closely to specific physical implementations. The AI question also illuminates human consciousness. By trying to create artificial minds, we're forced to articulate what we think minds are, and our difficulties in doing so reveal how little we understand about our own consciousness. Chapter 11. The Future of Philosophy of Mind. Where does philosophy of mind go from here? Despite centuries of work, the central questions remain unresolved. We don't know how consciousness arises from brain activity. We don't know whether minds are purely physical. We don't know if we have free will. We don't know how mental states represent the world. We don't even know for certain whether other beings are conscious. Some philosophers think we're making progress. We've refined the questions, identified key problems, and ruled out certain solutions. Even if we haven't solved the mind-body problem, we better understand what a solution would need to explain. Others are more pessimistic. Colin McGinn argues that the mind-body problem might be cognitively closed to us. Just as rats can't understand quantum mechanics because they lack the cognitive capacity, humans might lack the cognitive capacity to understand consciousness. We might be asking a question that's inherently beyond our ability to answer. This is a troubling thought. If consciousness is fundamentally mysterious to conscious beings, that suggests something deeply strange about the nature of mind. We're the one thing we should understand best, yet we might be the one thing we can't understand. But there are reasons for optimism. Neuroscience is advancing rapidly. We're mapping the brain in unprecedented detail, understanding neural circuits, and manipulating consciousness with increasing precision. Brain imaging lets us observe thought processes in real time. Optogenetics lets us control specific neurons and observe behavioral effects. This empirical progress might help resolve philosophical debates. If we can identify the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain patterns that correspond to conscious states, we might better understand the relationship between brain and mind. If we can artificially generate conscious experiences by stimulating certain brain regions, we might understand how physical processes produce subjective states. But some philosophers worry that neuroscience alone won't solve philosophical problems. You can accumulate infinite empirical data without answering conceptual questions. Knowing every physical fact about the brain won't automatically explain how physical facts generate mental facts. That requires conceptual analysis, not just empirical discovery. The relationship between philosophy and science is itself contentious. Some think philosophy should defer to science. Others think philosophy addresses questions that are inherently beyond empirical investigation. A middle position is that philosophy and science should work together, with philosophy clarifying concepts and interpreting scientific findings. Interdisciplinary approaches are increasingly common. Cognitive science combines philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, computer science, and linguistics to study the mind. Each discipline brings different methods and perspectives. Philosophy provides conceptual clarity. Psychology provides behavioral data. Neuroscience provides mechanistic understanding. Computer science provides computational models. This convergence might yield breakthroughs. Understanding how different levels of description relate, from molecular to neural to cognitive to conscious, might illuminate how the mind emerges from matter. Understanding how to build artificial minds might reveal what's essential to natural minds. There are also new philosophical approaches. Embodied cognition emphasizes that minds evolved to control bodies, and thinking is fundamentally tied to sensory-motor processes. Extended mind theory suggests that minds aren't confined to brains, but extend into tools and environments we use for thinking. Predictive processing models suggest the brain is primarily a prediction machine, constantly generating hypotheses about incoming sensory data. These approaches challenge traditional assumptions about where minds are and what they do. If minds extend beyond brains, that changes how we think about personal identity and mental causation. If thinking is prediction, that changes how we understand perception and action. Philosophy of mind is also becoming more diverse. Western philosophy has dominated, but Buddhist, Hindu, and other non-Western traditions have sophisticated theories of mind. Cross-cultural philosophy of mind might reveal assumptions we didn't know we were making and offer alternative frameworks for understanding consciousness. Ultimately, philosophy of mind matters because it's about understanding ourselves. We're conscious beings wondering about consciousness, minds trying to understand minds. This reflexivity makes the project especially difficult, but also especially important. Every advance in understanding the mind has practical implications. If we understand consciousness better, we can make better medical decisions about patients in comas or vegetative states. If we understand mental causation better, we can refine our concepts of responsibility and justice. If we understand AI better, we can make wise choices about developing and deploying it. But beyond practical applications, there's something deeply human about wanting to understand the mind. We want to know what we are, how we fit into the natural world, whether we're special or just complex machines. Philosophy of mind engages these ancient questions with modern tools. The questions are hard, the progress is slow, and the answers are elusive. But the questions matter, and the attempt to answer them, even if we never fully succeed, reveals truths about the nature of understanding itself. Conclusion. Explored dualism, materialism, and functionalism, finding problems with. We've covered a lot of ground. We started with the mind-body problem, the puzzle of how mental and physical relate. We confronted the hard problem of consciousness, the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience. We examined the problem of other minds and personal identity, showing how uncertain we are about consciousness in others and even the persistence of our own selves. We grappled with free will and mental causation, questioning whether we're genuinely free agents or determined systems. We explored intentionality, the aboutness of mental states that seems irreducible to physical properties. We considered artificial intelligence and whether machines could be conscious, and we looked at the future of philosophy of mind, the prospects for solving these ancient puzzles. If you feel more confused now than when we started, that's good. That means you're thinking carefully. Philosophy of mind doesn't offer easy answers because the questions are genuinely difficult. Every solution creates new problems. Every theory faces powerful objections. But this confusion isn't failure. It's clarity about what we don't know, and recognizing what we don't know is the first step toward genuine understanding. Here's what we can say with confidence. Consciousness is real. You are directly acquainted with your own conscious experiences in a way that provides certainty no amount of skepticism can undermine. Whatever else is uncertain, your own consciousness is not. Mental states have causal power. Your thoughts, decisions, and experiences affect your behavior. Whether this is compatible with physicalism or requires something beyond the physical is debatable, but mental causation is real. The mind-body problem is a genuine problem. It's not just confused thinking or bad philosophy. There's a real explanatory gap between physical and mental descriptions. Closing that gap will require either revising our understanding of the physical, accepting irreducible mental properties, or discovering some currently unimaginable solution. Understanding the mind is one of the great intellectual challenges of our time. It requires contributions from philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, computer science, and more. No single discipline has the answer, but together we might make progress. Most importantly, these questions matter. They're not abstract academic puzzles, but questions about what we are, how we should think about ourselves and others, what moral obligations we have, and what future we should create. The philosophy of mind is unfinished business. The problems we've discussed have persisted for centuries and will likely persist for centuries more. But every generation brings new perspectives, new tools, and new insights. Your generation might be the one that makes the breakthrough, or maybe not. Maybe consciousness will always be mysterious. Maybe we'll never fully understand the relationship between mind and matter. But the attempt itself is worthwhile. The questions are worth asking, even if the answers are elusive. If this journey through philosophy of mind has sparked something in you, if these questions won't leave your head, then you're thinking philosophically. And that's exactly what we need more of. Subscribe to Logic Over Spirit if you want more deep dives into philosophy, into the questions that don't have easy answers, but demand careful thought. We're building a community of people who choose intellectual honesty over comfortable illusions, who engage with hard questions because they matter. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next documentary. We're exploring the foundations of reality, the nature of knowledge, the basis of ethics, all the big questions philosophy tackles. Leave a comment telling me which problem in philosophy of mind troubles you most. Is it consciousness, free will, other minds, personal identity? Let's continue this conversation. Philosophy isn't a monologue, it's a dialogue, and your perspective matters. Share this video with someone who thinks they have all the answers. Challenge them to think deeper. Philosophy of mind shows that the more you understand, the more you realize how much you don't know. And that's not weakness, that's wisdom. If you want to go deeper, I've put resources in the description. Books, papers, lectures from the philosophers we've discussed. Philosophy of mind is a vast field, and this documentary is just an introduction. But it's an introduction that might change how you think about everything. Remember, you are a mind wondering about mind. That's remarkable. That's mysterious. And that's what makes us human. Thanks for watching. Keep thinking, keep questioning. And remember, reality doesn't care what you believe, but understanding reality might just change what you believe. This is Logic Over Spirit, where we choose clarity over comfort and truth over tradition.